a little on his chair, raise his hand slightly, and again I almost cried aloud. Again I beheld before me my nocturnal father. At last he noticed my importunate attention, and, first with surprise, then with vexation, he glanced in my direction, started to rise, and knocked down a small cane which he had leaned against the table. I instantly sprang to my feet, picked it up, and handed it to him. My heart was beating violently. He smiled in a constrained way, thanked me, and, putting his face close to my face, he elevated his eyebrows and parted his lips a little, as though something had struck him. "You are a very polite young man," he suddenly began in a dry, sharp, snuffling voice. "That is a rarity nowadays. Allow me to congratulate you. You have been well brought up." I do not remember precisely what answer I made to him, but the conversation between us was started. I learned that he was a fellow countryman of mine, that he had recently returned from America, where he had lived many years, and whither he was intending to return shortly. He said his name was Baron— I did not catch the name well. He, like my nocturnal father, wound up each of his remarks with an indistinct inward growl. He wanted to know my name. On hearing it he again showed signs of surprise. Then he asked me if I had been living long in that town, and with whom. I answered him that I lived with my mother. "And your father?" "My father died long ago." He inquired my mother's Christian name, and immediately burst into an awkward laugh, and then excused himself, saying that he had that American habit, and that altogether he was a good deal of an eccentric. Then he asked where we lived. I told him. 6. The agitation which had seized upon me at the beginning of our conversation had gradually subsided. I thought our intimacy rather strange, that was all. I did not like the smile with which the Baron questioned me, neither did I like the expression of his eyes when he fairly stabbed them into me. There was about them something rapacious and condescending, something which inspired dread. I had not seen those eyes in my dream. The Baron had a strange face. It was pallid, fatigued, and at the same time youthful in appearance, but with a disagreeable youthfulness. Neither had my nocturnal father that deep scar which intersected his whole forehead in a slanting direction, and which I did not notice until I moved closer to him. Before I had had time to impart to the Baron the name of the street and the number of the house where we lived, a tall negro, wrapped up in a cloak to his very eyes, approached him from behind, and tapped him softly on the shoulder. The Baron turned round, said, "Aha, at last!" and, nodding lightly to me, entered the coffee-house with the negro. I remained under the awning. I wished to wait until the Baron should come out again, not so much for the sake of entering again into conversation with him— I really did not know what topic I could start with— as for the purpose of again verifying my first impression. But half an hour passed, the Baron did not make his appearance. I entered the coffee-house, I made the circuit of all the rooms, but nowhere did I see either the Baron or the negro. Both of them must have taken their departure through the back door. My head had begun to ache a little, and with the object of refreshing myself I set out along the seashore to the extensive park outside the town, which had been laid out 10 years previously. After having strolled for a couple of hours in the shade of the huge oaks and plantain trees, I returned home. 7. Our maidservant flew to meet me, all tremulous with agitation, as soon as I made my appearance in the anteroom. I immediately divined, from the expression of her face, that something unpleasant had occurred in our house during my absence, and in fact I learned that half an hour before a frightful shriek had rung out from my mother's bedroom. When the maid rushed in, she found her on the floor in a swoon which lasted for several minutes. My mother had recovered consciousness at last, but had been obliged to go to bed, and wore a strange, frightened aspect. She had not uttered a word. She had not replied to questions. She had done nothing but glance around her and tremble. The servant had sent the gardener for a doctor. The doctor had come, and had prescribed a soothing potions, but my mother had refused to say anything to him either. The gardener asserted that a few moments after the shriek had rung out from my mother's room, he had seen a strange man run hastily across the flower-pots of the garden to the street gate. We lived in a one-story house whose windows looked out upon a fairly large garden. The gardener had not been able to get a good look at the man's face, but the latter was gaunt, and wore a straw hat and a long-skirted coat. The Baron's costume immediately flashed into my head. The gardener had been unable to overtake him. Moreover, he had been summoned without delay to the house and dispatched for the doctor. I went to my mother's room. She was lying in bed, whiter than the pillow on which her head rested. At sight of me she smiled faintly and put out her hand to me. I sat down by her side and began to question her. At first she persistently parried my questions, but at last she confessed that she had seen something which had frightened her greatly. "Did someone enter here?" I asked. "No," she answered hastily. "No one entered, but it seemed to me I thought I saw a vision." She ceased speaking and covered her eyes with her hand. I was on the point of communicating to her what I had heard from the gardener, and my meeting with the Baron also, by the way, but, for some reason or other, the words died on my lips. Nevertheless, I did bring myself to remark to my mother that visions do not manifest themselves in the daylight. "Stop," she whispered. "Please stop. Do not torture me now. Some day thou shalt know." Again she relapsed into silence. Her hands were cold, and her pulse beat fast and unevenly. I gave her a dose of medicine, and stepped a little to one side in order not to disturb her. She did not rise all day. She lay motionless and quiet, only sighing deeply from time to time, and opening her eyes in timorous fashion. Everyone in the house was perplexed. 8. Toward night a slight fever made its appearance, and my mother sent me away. I did not go to my own chamber, however, but lay down in the adjoining room on the divan. Every quarter of an hour I rose, approached the door on tiptoe, and listened. Everything remained silent, but my mother hardly slept at all that night. When I went into her room early in the morning, her face appeared to me to be swollen, and her eyes were shining with an unnatural brilliance. In the course of the day she became a little easier, but toward evening the fever increased again. Up to that time she had maintained an obstinate silence, but now she suddenly began to talk in a hurried, spasmodic voice. She was not delirious. There was sense in her words, but there was no coherency in them. Not long before midnight, she raised herself up in bed with a convulsive movement. I was sitting beside her, and with the same hurried voice she began to narrate to me, continually drinking water in gulps from a glass, feebly flourishing her hands, and not once looking at me the while. At times she paused, exerted an effort over herself, and went on again. All this was strange, as though she were doing it in her sleep, as though she herself were not present, but as though some other person were speaking with her lips, or making her speak. 9. "Listen to what I have to tell thee," she began. "Thou art no longer a young boy. Thou must know all. I had a good friend. She married a man whom she loved with all her heart, and she was happy with her husband. But during the first year of their married life they both went to the capital to spend a few weeks and enjoy themselves. They stopped at a good hotel and went out a great deal to theatres and assemblies. My friend was very far from homely. Everyone noticed her. All the young men paid